Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of the foXnoMad podcast. I'm your host, foXnoMad, Deniz Polat. Today, we're going to talk about. Well, it looks like I'm joined by a co-host who's actually going to be the guest, Deniz Polat, um, who, yeah, I've known you for about as long as you've been alive. Um, I wanted to talk a little bit about an experience that you had recently. I thought it was really interesting. So I want to talk about jury duty. Um, and yeah, so by the way, before we get started, I just wanted to just add this brush of I've traveled a lot. I have stayed in a lot of hotels, a lot of them. I mean, I think if I counted how many hotels I've stayed in, it's probably like I don't know if it's 1,000, but it's probably like 500 hotels I've ever stayed in. Like, and I mean, it might be the same hotel over and over, but 500 times. I don't think, I mean, I must have because I've traveled to some developing countries, but this is the first. So I filmed a video in a hotel in Sofia, Bulgaria. Okay. I was there for one, I was going to be there for one night, and it was a really cool hotel, highly recommended, brand new. So I filmed the video about it, great review. The service was excellent. Everything was fantastic. Video turned out really well. So excited. I get back to the hotel after filming. It's like late afternoon, evening. And I see something moving on the wall, and I think it's a spider, right? So yeah, usually with spider, I don't, whatever. But it's not, it doesn't have legs like a spider. So I look to it and I walk up to it and I see it, and it is a bed bug. And I take it
Oh
and I
no.
flush it down the toilet, and I look around. Normally, I inspect rooms very carefully because I don't want bed bugs, obviously. This time I didn't. I wasn't as careful as I normally am. Maybe it's a new hotel, a familiar, city, all that stuff. Oh boy, was this room infested. Like I was like they were like everywhere. They were like in this headboard thing. So I had to nope out of there really fast. They were very cool about it. They said they had the problem 5 months ago and they didn't expect it to come back. Obviously, it is back, really back. And yeah, so I've been dealing with steaming and cleaning all of my things. I wasn't in the room for very long, although my bag was on the floor. I normally never keep my bag or suitcase near the bed, but it was on the floor. And so I washed everything. I'm now, steamed my bags and stuff. I think I took the precautions necessary. But yeah, I was like, I gotta get out there. They were super cool. They refunded me in cash, uh, basically doubled the rate. I don't know if they just miscalculated or what, but they were super apologetic. So that was my experience. I'm sure I have had bed or like encountered bed bugs. I'm thinking of a specific country I've been to like 30 times. I'm sure I've seen them. Let's just put it that way. But this was like a lot. And they look hungry because as soon as I sat on the bed, I wasn't going to bed anymore. I just sat down. I just see them like, look, So anyway, sorry for that detour, but maybe I can
No
do a
problem.
whole podcast on the bed bug, what you have to do if you encounter bed bugs. Because I mean, I've taken it too far. Let's put it this way. But I have sanitized I've just, you just got to make sure. So maybe we can talk about that. Anyway, sorry for that little detour. Today, I want to talk to you, Dennis, about jury duty. And this came up because it's something I'm really curious about. I think a lot of people, especially outside the United States, don't know about jury duty because most countries don't have juries. They don't do jury by trial. So I want to explain a little bit about why there is the jury duty in the United States, what that means, and where it started. So there are two types of jury. I'm not a lawyer, and it's more complicated. This I'm giving the high level details, but there's basically two levels of jury. There's something called a grand jury. This is something that comes from England. It is something that is very old, like hundreds of years old. America is the only country aside from Liberia, which, if you know the connection between those two countries, maybe not so surprising, that have a grand jury still. Essentially, a grand jury is um, where the the prosecution will take evidence to a judge, and if to prove they have enough evidence to go to a trial. That's what a grand jury is. So you may have heard of that on the news if you're following U.S. cases. But then there's also what is called, uh, I believe it's called a petite jury, um, which is essentially this is a citizen's right to a trial by jury, and it is something that is featured in the United States Constitution. It is considered a fundamental principle of the American legal system. So, uh, the jury system, again, comes from something that started in England several hundred years ago, and now it has remained in the United States. Remember, United States formed by mostly British colonists, at least the government was. And it is mentioned, juries and trials are mentioned in the Bill of Rights, which are 10 Bill of Rights. There, so yeah, 10 Bill of Rights. It is in the Fifth, Sixth, and Seventh Amendments. So those are the amendments where you can find that. There are three types of juries in the United States: investigative jury, that is determining whether enough evidence exists to warrant a criminal indictment; petite jury, which is also known as a trial jury. We'll get to that one in a second. And that is where the juries listen to evidence presented during the course of a criminal trial and are charged with determining the guilt or innocence of an accused party; and civil juries, which are charged with evaluating civil lawsuits. We won't go into civil lawsuits. We won't go into grand juries any more than we have. But we do have somebody here that has been on a uh, trial jury, we'll call it, because petite jury, I think that's what's called. Um, and that I'll just go into a little bit, just a small bit more about the history, which is in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, it accused George III, British or English king, of depriving us in many cases the benefits of trial by jury. Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution states that trials shall be by jury. The right was expanded with the Sixth Amendment to the United States Constitution, which states, in part, in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed. And according to the Seventh Amendment of the United States Constitution, it guarantees jury trial in civil cases. Now, the last I'll get into this background is that the United States Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land, in 1968 said in the ruling of Duncan versus Louisiana, those who wrote our constitutions knew from history and experience that it was necessary to protect the unfounded criminal charges brought to eliminate enemies against judges too responsive to the voice of a higher authority. The framers of the Constitution strove to create an independent judiciary, but insisted upon further protection against arbitrary action, providing an accused with the right to a trial by jury of their peers, give them an inestimable safeguard against the corrupt or overzealous prosecutor and against the compliant, biased, or sorry, eccentric judge. So there you go. I hope that answers why the jury system exists. And if you look at the United States government and constitution, especially as sort of a response to essentially British rule at the time, monarchy, then you'll find that. So if you're wondering if it is a criminal case, it is trial by jury and trial by jury of your peers. And that means you as a regular citizen gets called into a trial, right? So juries are 12 people, if I'm not mistaken. So Dennis, tell me, how does that work? So we know why the jury system exists. We know it occurs. And we now know, especially for people who are outside the United States might not know, that they're just calling regular US citizen. Like if you're a citizen of the country, you can be called to trial jury duty at any time. What is that like? How did this process begin?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It was a very interesting experience. I would say about a month ago or a few weeks ago, I received something in the mail, and that was my summons to report for jury duty. Um, and um, they don't, I think they call in more people than they'll need usually, just in case, because I think a lot of people don't show up. um, and so, on a Monday morning, I showed up at the courthouse here, and there were, I would say, maybe over 100 people who had been summoned, waiting in a very big room. Um, you check in, someone who works at the courthouse comes in and explains what the process is going to be. So essentially, when they are looking for jurors, the deputies will come into the room and call out about 30 to 40 names. And those are the people who are being considered to be on a jury for a specific case. So when that happens, my name was called in one of those groups. Not everybody's name gets called. That's another detail. Um, you line up and you go into a courtroom, and that's when the the judge and the lawyers from both sides are all present. You don't know anything about the case, except a very vague. They give you some information before they start questioning potential jurors. So
So before you
it's
go on, let me ask you
mhm,
two questions. How much
yeah.
time do you have notice? So you get the letter. Is it like next week or is it like in 3 months?
No, so it's not next week or 3 months. I would say I had about a month's notice, if I remember correctly. So it's enough time that, I was able to let work know that, on this date, I'm most likely going to have to go in. So when you get your letter in the mail, it's on one page, back and front instructions, where it tells you to call this like automated hotline of sorts the the day before you are being summoned. And when you call that number, it will tell you if everyone is in a group number. So when you call that number, it will tell you if your group number is going to be needed for that Monday morning. So if your group number is not included in the groups that are on the automated message, then you don't have to go to jury duty. My group number was included. So, and I found this out the night before. So it's basically like a 50-50 chance that you're actually going to have to go in. And because it's, part of, your civic duty in the United States, employers are understanding about it because anyone can get called for jury duty at any time. Um, and yeah, so it's a little bit of a disruption to your daily work life, at least for one day,
Eh,
because mhm.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, and my understanding is that they have to pay you and that they can't like let you go, quote unquote, fire you because you have jury duty, right? I think is that a protection or do they say anything about that?
I don't know for sure. I know like for my job, it wasn't an issue. Um, I imagine for some people, just having a backlog of work might be an issue, if, they're gone for a day or 2 days or whatever it might be. But my experience was, my workplace was very understanding about it as long as I was, keeping them updated on my schedule, basically.
Yeah,
Um,
I
mhm,
always just thought that there was a like in the law that they can't fire you or and they have to pay you.
mhm.
So even if the trial goes like 3 months or whatever it is. So I was just curious if they said anything about that or anything.
They didn't. But when we were, when our pool of 40 potential jurors were being questioned, a lot of the questions were, they ranged from, they were basic yes or no questions for the most part. Do you feel like you have a good enough grasp of the English language to be able to, understand what's going on in the courtroom was a question. Do you have any? They told us that potentially they were thinking that the trial could last 3 days. And so when they told us that, they asked, would anyone have, a significant issue with being able to show up for 3 days, basically. And what they think of, as important. Yeah, most people are missing work, so that's not a good enough excuse necessarily. But if you have medical issues or if you have like a medical appointment, let's say you have a pre-surgery appointment that you need to go to, things that are not easily rescheduled. Those are legitimate, excuses to get off of jury duty. Some people said, some kind of funny, you can tell people really want to get out of doing jury duty a lot of the time. And so some people have excuses where, the judge is also questioning whether it's legitimate, or, if it's a good enough reason to get out of doing jury duty. So we went through about 2 hours of that kind of questioning. First, it was the judge asking us questions, and then lawyers from both sides, the prosecution and the defense, also asked us questions. And they're asking questions to the group as a whole, but if you have, if you feel like you need to explain more, you raise your hand and explain to everybody, why you answered one way or another for one of those questions. And then when that process was over, the lawyers on both sides have to agree to who they pick for the jury. They pick 13 people, actually. And in the beginning, before the trial starts, they pick a random alternate out of those 13 people. So the point of that is to have, in case someone gets sick on the jury or is unable to continue, with the deliberations or anything at the end of the trial, this alternate has sat through the entire trial and paid attention and would be able to step in as, like a substitute for a juror that, was unable to complete the process. We don't know who the alternate is until the very end.
So there's 13 of you, and one of you is an alternate, but you don't know if you're the alternate.
Exactly.
Got it. And
so it requires them to pay attention, and
yeah, that's smart. That's clever. So at this point, you're talking to the lawyers and the judge. And you said you know something vaguely about the case. Is that like, is it a murder case? Is it
yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the case can be about anything, right? Like it could be anything from like robbery to something like shoplifting, right? Maybe. I mean, like something like a minor-ish crime, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. So any kind of criminal case. So what they do tell us when they're in the process of picking the jury, one of the questions is, for this particular case, this case involves robbery. So they tell us that. They're very vague. I'm pretty sure they said robbery or burglary or something like that. And then they asked, would that, is that something that anyone here, any of the potential jurors, would have an issue with, being impartial and unbiased when evaluating this case? There
So
were a
something
few
like,
people.
oh, sorry. So something like, my house just got burglarized like 3 weeks ago, and I hear that word and
Yes.
it triggered. Okay, got it.
Yes. So there were a few people who had experienced, like, either their house getting burglarized, or they were a bank teller and they've been robbed before, or things like that. And so they mentioned those things, and that doesn't automatically disqualify them from being a juror. So when they explain in further detail, the judge will ask them, do you think, is this something that would render you incapable of being unbiased when considering this trial? And some people said yes, and some people said no. So it's not an automatic disqualification, but they like to know those details, and I think that influences who the lawyers pick to be on a jury. But both sides have to agree on who are jurors.
So the prosecution and the defense have to both agree on the jurors. Does the judge also get a say in who's a juror or not, or is it just the lawyers?
From my understanding, the judge does not get a say. It's the lawyers, and I'm assuming that the judge maybe approves approves the list or doesn't. But from my understanding, it was just the lawyers on both sides who make
Oh,
that decision.
interesting. So you're here now, you're picked as a juror. Um, you don't have any of the biases that, they say you can do it. Then do you go at this point, like you're off work, right? So it's not like you have to work at night or something. Like, you know what I
Mhm,
mean? Like it's basically your job now, at least for the next couple days.
mhm.
Do you then go home and then the next day the trial starts? Like how does that work once you get selected?
No, so once you get selected, they, call out your name or your number. Every juror has a number. They call out your number and tell you you've been selected, and then they dismiss everybody else. And then once that happens, the trial pretty much began right away. So, within a few minutes. I can't remember if like we went back into there's a room off to the side of the courtroom where the jury, that's where all the decisions are made, after the trial and things like that. So I believe we went into that room and then we were called back into the courtroom. Um, and the opening art statements began right away and the trial began right away.
Uh,
We're given some instructions from the judge, where he tells us, the both sides will they explain the case in more detail, but he says both sides will give their opening statements, and then if there are witnesses or evidence to be presented, then everything just proceeds immediately.
and so I wonder if they do that to prevent fraud or tampering with the jury. I wonder if that's why it's like so, or if it's just logistical, or maybe both. It seems I really thought like you get picked as the juror, and then you wait a day or two or something. So it's like immediate. You go in. So that means that the defendant is waiting, right? The trial is essentially ready to go. It's just waiting for the jurors.
Yeah, I mean, when they're doing the jury selection process, the defendant, the lawyers, everyone is in that room, is in the courtroom.
Oh, okay, okay. So
Hmm.
okay, I didn't know that. So,
Yeah.
and is there a dress code, by the way? Random question.
Um, no. So on the summons that I received in the mail, it just says, don't wear like shorts and a halter top. Basically, literally, it says that on the paper. It says, the courtroom could be cold, but there's no, I saw a wide range of, wardrobes, so there
Interesting.
isn't really a dress code. Yeah.
Okay, so you get picked and the trial starts. You know it's about robbery.
Hmm.
Um, and then do you just get thrown into the case? I mean, is there any more background you get, or it's just it's time for the
Um,
lawyers to present their case?
yeah, the lawyers immediately, like I said, they have their opening statements. That's where learn about what the case is. And then they start immediately, with like the prosecution had a few, witnesses who come up and testify. Not necessarily witnesses to what happened, but um, and yeah, it starts immediately, and we're told we're allowed to take notes if we want to, but the judge, it was interesting because he said you're allowed to take notes, to kind of follow the story, but don't get so focused on your notes that you're not listening, to what they're saying, because in the end, we're also told in the very beginning that we're not going to get the testimony, we're not going to be able to hear the testimony again or get like a transcript, right? So you really have to pay attention, um, and be able to kind of make a decision after all is said and done. So
So
yeah.
you start listening to the case. I is it like the movies? Is it, like you can't handle the truth? Like, is it really like high energy and intense, or is it like 8 hours or 4 hours? How long is it? And is it, what is that like? Like, how long does it take? Are you there for 8 hours? And what's happening in that time?
So the very first day, when the Monday morning that I was summoned for jury duty and didn't know if I would actually get chosen. We had to be there quite early. For me, being anywhere at 8 a.m. is pretty early, and that's the time we had to be there. Um, by the time they picked the jury, it was a it was close to lunchtime. It was about noon or 12:30. And then we were told like we get an hour for lunch. Everybody does. So we started with the opening statements and a little bit of the trial, and then we had a lunch break for an hour. Um, and
Yeah,
uh,
I missed the
oh,
mute button.
sorry.
Do they pay for your lunch, or do you have to bring your lunch or pay for it?
So they do not pay for your lunch. So I believe at the end of the trial, after you do your jury duty, you do get a small like daily stipend. Um, Honestly, I don't know the exact amount. It's something very little, but it's meant to cover your like either gas and or food expenses. So I think it ranges from like $35 to $50 or something like that. But I haven't gotten that, and you don't get it until you're done with your jury duty. So
And that's
I
per
imagine
day?
it's per day.
Okay.
Yeah. Um, and you don't really have enough time to, on the first day, I don't think a lot of people brought their lunch because they didn't think that they would be chosen to be on a jury. They thought they were going home. I was one of those people. So, there's a cafeteria in the building. You don't really have enough time. An hour isn't really enough time to leave and come back and be able to enjoy your lunch. So most of us just stayed in the building and had lunch. An interesting thing about the cafeteria is that there is a roped off section of the cafeteria that is juror seating. You don't have to sit there as a juror, but you have that option, and no one else is allowed to sit there. So they do that because as a juror, you're not supposed to interact with the lawyers or anyone that is part of the case, the trial, the witnesses, like no, but none of those people. And so by sitting in that juror only section, you're ensuring that you won't be interacting with those people because you do see them, around in the building. And it's always a very awkward, like, you don't make eye contact, you just keep walking kind of situation.
The defendant is there as well. The person who's being
Yeah,
tried, yeah.
yes, everybody is there. So
Now,
yeah, you have to be really careful.
and now, I mean, it is a silly question, but like if it's a murder trial, right? Is the defendant just they're not guilty yet, but do they just wander around? I mean, you know what I mean?
So if it was a murder trial, I imagine, courthouses are built so that the jury and the lawyers would have like separate elevators, separate entrances, everything would be separate. So I imagine if it was a case like that, they would have made that more of, they would have stressed that more, the separation. For us, we were just told, you might see the lawyers when you're walking down the hall or like in the bathroom or something, try to avoid situations like that. But from from what I know and what we talked about is that, there are like separate entrances for jurors, we're usually escorted, we're always pretty much escorted by a deputy. Um, because the rooms that we like meet in are secure, and just separate from everyone else. So I imagine if it was a more serious case, they would have made that, emphasize that more. But I think because it wasn't as, you know, as big of a deal.
So you're listening to this case, um, like I was asking before, is it like what is the tempo and the pace? Or what is it like?
So we're told from the beginning that it's not going to be like what we see on TV. The judge said that, the lawyers said that multiple times. Um, the pace is quick, but there was no yelling in the courtroom. Um, there were maybe a couple of like objections to things, but it wasn't anybody standing up and screaming at the judge or at the other lawyers or anything like that. But it was very fast paced, and I think it's just because they wanted to get through the case and get to the deliberation period. So no
And
yelling, not
how
very dramatic necessarily, but yeah.
how long was that the trial part before you get to deliberation?
So it started, let's say we had about half of a day on the first day, and then one full day after that, and then about another half day. So it was about 2 days total of listening in the courtroom. And then we had about a day and a half for, you know, deliberation.
So that's longer than I would expect. So like you would think a robbery is like cut and dry kind of thing. Like, okay, we have camera footage or we have a fingerprint or something like that. In this particular case, were there things that you thought, okay, that's like a hard, good, strong indicator of innocence or guilt? Or was the case more like you say, it's a story, right? So both sides are creating a narrative for the person in different directions to convince the jury. Um, what was it like? They're just spitting facts, or are they kind of weaving this into a specific narrative that they want you to believe, I guess?
So it was in this case was interesting. So the two charges, so the defendant was, being accused of two things. The two charges were statutory burglary, which in essence is breaking and entering with the intent to commit a crime. Um, and then the second charge was petty larceny, which is the actual like taking of the things, the actual stealing part essentially. There are, more details within both of those charges, obviously, but that's the gist. So the only piece of like hard evidence that was presented that they had was blood found in two parts of the house. Not a lot of blood, just like a drop. It wasn't like a crazy, Dexter scene or something like that. But there was some blood found on a door, not on a doorknob, but a door inside the house, and then a little bit of blood on a sheet in a baby crib. The homeowners were not home when this happened, and it happened within like a 20-hour period, overnight into the next day. There was a broken window, but there was no like blood or fingerprints found around the window. So the only like hard evidence that they had were these blood drops in these two places in the house. Um, there were a few items stolen, electronics stolen from the house that were never recovered. So there's that. And so the prosecution was they were able to, uh, paint this picture where obviously this person was found inside the house, right? They got into the house, but it was very hard to convince some people on the jury in particular, of how he got into the house. So he was in the house for sure. His blood was there. He wasn't friends with the homeowners. The blood in the two parts of the house matched to the same person. Um, and it was despite that, despite the fact that he was in the house and nobody was home, he was not a friend of anybody. It was not like a friendly visit or something like that. It was hard for some people to put, you know, the breaking in part with him being in the house, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and for people listening who may not know, all 12 people have to agree, right? So if it's innocent or, well, they have to agree that it's guilty, as opposed to if you can't all agree, even if one person doesn't agree, then it's
Mhm.
considered a, is it a no contest
Mis-
or
it's a mistrial.
mistrial? Okay.
Hmm.
So all 12 people can either go it's innocent, or I guess a hung jury, right? Is that what it's called? Like when they,
It's a hung jury, yes,
yeah.
when we can't agree.
And so what is the deliberation like? I mean, you go into the room and then what do you guys start immediately? Like, how does the discussion work? Who's leading the discussion? How does that go?
So before we are released into deliberation, the judge gives us instructions. He tells us that we're going to get literally a packet of instruction that explains, the defendant is to, and we're told this multiple times, but the defendant is to be considered innocent unless the prosecution is able to prove that he is guilty. So you have to go under the assumption that he's innocent and go by what the prosecution has presented to you and how they've presented it to you, and if that is enough to convict someone. Um,
Which,
we
by the
get.
way, is not the same in every country. There are countries where you're presumed guilty, and it's up to the defense to make the case for innocence. I just I throwing that out there because I think it's a really it's not just a given that everywhere in the world it's like that. So
Mhm. Yeah, so the burden of proof is on the prosecution, not on the defense. And they tell you that in the beginning because they also tell you that the defendant is not, he does not have to testify, and the defense does not have to present any witnesses. And we are not to hold that against, you can't say to yourself, well, he's obviously he's guilty because he's not even speaking up for himself, like
and that's a
you're
Fifth Amendment, right? Or is it the
Mhm.
same?
Yeah, yeah, so you can't hold that against the defendant, and he did not testify. And I mean, that's not something we're supposed to consider. So in the instructions it explains that there's kind of a reiteration of what the defendant's rights are, what the prosecution is to do in a trial, and um, we get a some papers that explain the charges, and there are a few definitions of words that are mentioned in the charges that might be beneficial for us to be able to make a decision. Um, the judge also tells us that we are to appoint a foreperson or a leader who is to read the verdict in court, but also to lead the discussions when we're in the deliberation room. Um, and so, we're supposed to agree on someone, and then kind of keep the discussion organized and respectful, and consider everyone's point of view, and
So
be adults about it.
does that discussion start, like, I mean, I know it's you're deliberating. How long was the total deliberation that you did? I mean, how many hours was it in total?
I would say, I mean, almost 6, 7 hours probably total.
Okay. And
Um,
so how does the it start? Is it like everyone says innocent, guilty, and then does everybody kind of explain? I'm guessing everybody didn't agree right away if it was 6, 7 hours.
mhm.
Um, is that how it started for the most part?
So yeah, I think once we designated a leader, um, who was me actually in this case, uh, you nobody knows how to do things, right? Nobody has done this before for the most part. We had one guy on the jury who had done this maybe 30 years prior. But otherwise, it's you kind of have to think on your feet on how to organize and how to kind of wrangle, 12 different, very different people, from strangers essentially, um, and how to give everyone time to speak. And so I think one person just started out with their opinion. and we went from there. The first day of deliberating was a little chaotic, because everyone wants to. Some people had very strong opinions. Some people were on the fence about one or both of the charges. Um, Others had different observations from what they saw in the courtroom or what they heard. It was a lot of us kind of making sure we had the puzzle pieces right, first of all, like we all heard the same thing. And it's kind of a game of telephone sometimes where everyone, hears and catches different things when you're listening to hours of testimony. So, um, it was a lot of us trying to get the story straight. We were allowed to request different pieces of evidence in the deliberation room so that we could look over it again. We didn't have very much to go on. There was like body cam footage that we were able to watch again, and then the actual evidence of the blood sample or the cheek swab, um, things like that. But we didn't have too much to go on, essentially.
And when does the deliberation end? In other words, I would assume if you all agree, innocent or guilty, it's over. But
Mhm,
in your case, right, you guys ended up as a hung jury. You did not all agree. At what
mhm.
point do you end the deliberation and say we're just not going to come to a consensus?
So I think on the first day of deliberation, we it was pretty evident that some people were maybe not going to change their stance. In the very beginning, we were much more split as a group on what we thought guilty or not guilty on the different charges. But as we continued to discuss and consider different definitions and different possibilities, we there were people who changed their minds, and so when we have a question for the judge, we were instructed to write it on a piece of paper, hand it to the deputy who sits outside of the door the entire time we're in the deliberation room. And then the deputy hands those questions to the judge and to the lawyers, and they all have to agree on the response they give us. Um, so if it's like a question about a definition of a word, um, and let's say it is included in the packet, but we want like a more elaborate answer or something, the lawyers on both sides have to agree that on what they give us. So it could also be we're not going to answer that question for you. Like you have all the materials, that we've already provided for you, which happened with one of our questions. Um, we did ask, what happens if we don't come can't come to a decision. And on that first day we did ask that, and the judge wrote that it's our duty to do our best to try to come to a unanimous verdict. And I think he was essentially saying like spend a little more time on it. And so the first day we spent that whole half a day deliberating, and we came back the next day and in a much more organized, I had a strategy the next day in a much more organized manner. um, and then it got to a point where we were perhaps talking in circles a little bit, and it was very clear that a very small minority were not going to change their stance, and that's when we knew, like, okay, this is, it's not going to be unanimous.
Okay, and so I'm just throwing out numbers, right? So it seems like
Mm-hmm.
even if two people don't agree or whatever it happens to be, um, the jury's hung. You give that to the judge, right? They accept it. They go, okay, these people cannot decide or come to a
Mm-hmm.
consensus. Then what happens? In other words, what is the process for you and what happens to the defendant?
So, we wrote on the piece of paper, we're not going to come to unanimous decision. We waited around a little bit in that room until they were ready for us in the courtroom. And then we were called into the courtroom, and the judge asked us, Um, is it correct that you were unable to reach a unanimous decision? I said, that's correct. And then the judge asked the prosecution, the lawyers, if they wanted verbal confirmation from each of the jurors that that was the case. And so they went through all of us, and asked us, were you unable to come to a unanimous decision? And we had to confirm. Everyone had the same answer, obviously. And with that, um, our job was done. We were a hung jury, and it's deemed a mistrial. I looked that up afterwards. So essentially, the prosecution, if they so choose, can try this case again, but it will be an entirely new jury. They could take their chances basically with a new jury, but they won't have any additional evidence, or you know they won't be presenting anything new, but maybe the way they present things
Mhm.
could could change the outcome. But our job is done after that.
So the person is free at this point, right? So they're free, right?
So I would say, within this particular, in this instance, yes. But if he's being tried for something else, uh, he could have multiple criminal cases going on. There's that too. So on this particular charge, in this particular, crime, yeah, he's essentially off the hook for
Mhm.
now, unless they decide to try him again. But if he's being tried, he could be being tried for other things at the same time.
Got it. So at this point, you guys are off the hook. You all go home.
Mm.
I guess as we wrap things up, do you have any final thoughts on the process, what you saw, anything you learned? I mean, I find the process really fascinating. I think people listening as well, because a
Mhm.
lot of people haven't done jury duty, and a lot of people, like I said, don't know what it is. They don't know the mechanics. Are there any takeaways you have from your experience doing jury duty?
So I thought the process was really interesting also. I would like to add that after, the case is dismissed, and we go back to our little room. The judge actually came in and spoke with us, and not about the case, but he told us that they also look for feedback on how they can make the process smoother. And he talked to us generally about how things like this go, and he encouraged us to, I'm sure it's like this everywhere, you can go to your local, like, county courthouse and sit in on some trials. Like, we had a school group come in during the closing statements, of middle schoolers, to listen and see how things work. And so the judge encouraged us, to go in there, occasionally, and listen to cases that we might see on the news later on. Um, and the other thing, he told us, was that sometimes the lawyers will want to speak to jurors after a case like this, not about they're not not about the case specifics, but to ask jurors, like, what resonated with them, what they maybe could have explained better or done better. And you mentioned, the lawyers, or, like, earlier you said something about them creating a story and a narrative, when they're presenting information to us. And I do think that one of the things we agreed on was that, the prosecution didn't, obviously they presented the evidence, but they didn't do a great job of creating that narrative and that story. They were relying heavily on the guy was in the house, right? But not creating the story of, he lived a few doors down, and it was the middle of the night, and this and that. So some of us did give some feedback. It's interesting, because lawyers see it as kind of how, like, earlier you also said it, a case like this might be more cut and dry, but you realize when you're talking to the other jurors that for some people it's not that cut and dry, and they need a little bit more convincing, more of the story and the narrative, rather than making it up themselves. So it was a very interesting process. It definitely encouraged me to learn more about the law. Um, and yeah, I thought it was a really interesting. I'm glad I was picked, and there were some long days, and dealing with people sometimes it's pretty difficult. And but I think it was a really great experience.
Yeah, it sounds super interesting. Thanks for sharing. You know, I think maybe a lot of people listening are like, that's a super cumbersome process. Although I do kind of respect why it was put into place, right? It's a protection against corruption. It's a protection against having a single person make a decision for better or for worse. That's the system, and those are some of the reasons why it was created. Um, but I do think it attempts to remove biases as much as possible, and again presume the innocence, right? If you need 12 people to agree on something, I'm surprised every case isn't a hung jury. I mean, getting two people to getting two people to agree on
Yeah.
something is difficult. Um, so yeah, thank you. Do you have anything else you want to add? Any other final thoughts? Any quick things that you were like, huh, I didn't know that, or that was weird?
I mean, I definitely learned. So when you're on a jury, you're instructed until the case is over, you're not allowed to Google anything related to the case. That includes definitions. We have our phones with us, but we're told not to Google definitions. You can't tell anybody um, about the case as it's happening. Um, you know, there were times like I really wanted to tell you about what was going on because I feel like you're a very logical person, and your insight definitely would have helped me. But you can't talk about it. You can't Google things.
You can't make a podcast
I
about it.
you
So
can,
just for
yeah,
everyone
until it's
listening
over.
and watching, yeah, the case is over.
Yeah, the case is over. But I feel like that was difficult for people, because it's hard talking to strangers, and you're making a decision that could potentially impact someone's life. And I think no matter how it's not a murder, right? But no matter how small or big the case is, you are going to impact someone's life in some way. And I think a lot of people struggled with that. And that may have impacted some people's ability to say whether or not he was guilty. um, it is a big responsibility, and they really stress that from the beginning of being chosen as a juror. They I don't think anyone was taking it lightly, which is encouraging. Um, but yeah, it is kind of a cumbersome and complicated process when you think about it. And I'm also, after this experience, I am surprised that more juries are not hung juries because, like you
Yeah.
said, it's really hard to get people to agree, on something.
I was just reading about a murder trial a few weeks ago, and I read something like, "Oh, it was a very fast decision. 4 hours, they found the person guilty." And that just puts it into perspective. Like 4 hours is a short amount of time for like you said, for that many people to agree, but also for like a murder trial where somebody's potentially death penalty. I'm not sure, but at least a very, if not life sentence. So when you hear those numbers, like the jury deliberated for 6, 7 hours, it seems like not a lot of time or a long time. I mean, uh, so yeah, so it is super fascinating. I think that's really interesting. Um, yeah, and I guess every U.S. citizen can be potentially called up. And there are a lot of countries where, the system works completely different. So if you live somewhere where, if you're listening to this or watching this, where the trial system is different, let me know, at Twitter, at foXnoMad, or in the comments. I would love to hear, because I think it's really interesting how every country kind of does it differently. Thank you, Dennis, for sharing your experience with jury duty. Um,
Thanks for having me.
that was pretty interesting. I was like, I was just expecting it to be like, you can't handle the truth, and then like everybody's arguing, and it's like 12 Angry Men uh, movie type style thing. But um, it seems like the real action is in the deliberation room as opposed to the trial. Like that's where things could probably get more intense and more heated. Um, but it seems like, unless I'm wrong, everybody was more or less civil. It was just coming to an agreement that was difficult.
Everyone was very respectful and civil, but we were told afterward that the deputy had told the judge that we were one of the loudest groups he's ever had. So,
Okay,
yeah.
all right, interesting. Respectful but loud. Okay, that's a
Yeah.
polite way of saying things. Thanks again. Thank you everybody for listening. Like I said, if your country, where you live does things differently, let me know down in the comments. Also, if you're listening to the podcast, those 5 stars really help us get the word out. So Stitcher, Google, Apple Podcasts, where you're listening to this, 5 stars and a little nice comment really goes a long way. If this is on YouTube, give a like and a subscribe. That also helps. We are trying to go weekly with the show, so you'll notice more episodes coming out, and all thanks to your encouragement and your 5 stars and your subscribes. So, thank you again. Thank you everybody. Thank you, Deniz, and we'll talk to you guys in the next episode.